Hello, in today's video we're going to talk about building a rally trap, and more specifically the question of counter research, which is how much might does that actually add to your account, and then what do you need to build a rally trap with. So one thing I was kind of contemplating when I initially built my trap was actually whether or not to do these down here. So at the time, okay, I was about 70 million research core might, roughly. Okay, when I added Destroyer, that was about 1.5 million, and then once I added the rest of these, that was about 25 to 27 mil, all said and done. Which means that now, if you look at my research might, now that I've actually tacked on that might, right, to get these kind of stat bonuses, provided I can still get more, you know, you got to work on familiars and all that jazz. But the main thing is, right, and this is really kind of where, where it matters is, so if you look at your might, you'll notice your research might now went from 70 to 97. It's the difference between about 30 million troop might, which, more or less, that could be a problem for some people, could be bad in others. You'll notice I have 390 million troop might. Now, as far as building a trap goes, and all of the little things that you need to know about building one, I think there are a lot of places that a person could go into, and I'm going to really try to break it down as much as I possibly can. So the first thing when building a trap is that you really, honestly, right from the get-go, if you've been clicking on turf quests, you've already screwed it up. Because you don't want any of this turf quest might at all. The more might you have that you can't get rid of, which, going back to this, okay, all of the might you get from familiars and artifacts and hero armies and player level and research and quest might and building might, this is might that you cannot really shave off. Now, I can cut building might to a certain extent just by destroying some buildings. I can cut, maybe a little bit on quest might if I don't accept quests, and and artifacts, it's like kind of a no-brainer for some people right now that, I'm going to dump a lot into artifacts. I'm going to dump a lot into familiars. Because, it's only what, 2, 3, and then hero armies, that if you're wondering what hero armies is, that's actually the hero might, okay? You'll notice that I don't actually upgrade them past rank 7, and I'm not very, how do you say, I do very bare minimum here for that reason. It's like you're really just wanting the rank 7 tier option here for the stat. You don't need it for really much of anything else unless you're just trying to min-max the game, right? So going back, one of the things that I'm trying to get across to you here is that might in this instance is going to be very crucial for building a rally trap, just like it is for building a solo trap. Now, one thing that I can say is that a solo trap and a rally trap have a lot in common in that they're basically going to pick out, initially anyway, basically, an initial choice that a lot of people are going to make here is, okay, do I do phalanxes and not get wedges, which I think is a mistake. I honestly think get the wedges. Don't be jumping around thinking that you just don't need the wedges. You really probably need the wedges. Most people, it's like very seldom do you get hit with range, so you don't really use an inf wedge all that often. So I tend to bait in an inf wedge and normally defend in a range wedge. And something that I'm exploring right now is, okay, I obviously can't do Cav phalanx because Cav is just, it gets murdered every time. You got imp coming and you send it in Cav phalanx or Cav wedge, you would think that would work, but more often than not, that ends up blowing up in my face most of the time. And it's just because, really, statistically, there's just a lot of disadvantages that you'll get along with sitting in those phalanxes. And it really comes down to the fact that, okay, if you look at like an imp phalanx, for example, okay, infantry's all up in the front, and then you have range, and then you have cavalry, and most people realize that cav is fastest, imp is slowest. There are certain advantages and disadvantages to the unit types themselves, and if you're not aware of what these are, you can literally just pick a unit type, and then click on the disadvantages of, weaknesses and counters to see what breaks what, and then obviously the actual detail tab tells you how well they do. at one thing, right? And you have HP, defense, and then attack. Now, of course, you look at this, it's 4 stars. Whoop-de-doo, what's the deal here? Well, you notice his speed's literally zip, but if you look at, like, go to details tab, you'll notice his speed is 2 stars. And then it's funny enough, like you look at the detail tab here, it's 3 stars. And then if you look at the detail tab here, it's, get this, 4 stars. There is a difference in terms of speed that changes relation to the actual, tier of the troop, but it also matters what type of troop it is, So like, for example, a range unit will show up as 2 stars here, but you notice that if you go to details tab here, that a cav unit shows up as 2 stars as well. But the difference is going to be primarily in that, between the speed of each unit type, you'll notice that speed is almost a constant. In other words, in order of magnitude, which unit's going to have less than other. And that's basically the problem, right? Is that you basically cav is fastest, range is right behind it, and inf is the slowest. Now, with that in mind, that comes in handy when you're trying to trap, because you need to know what is coming at you relatively quick, and you got to be able to change very quickly. So if a rally is coming at you, if you're not familiar with the concept, right, you need to be able to swap long before you even really get to gear so much. But you need to be able to, very quickly determine, okay, I need, I've got range coming, I need to go inf wedge. If I've got infantry coming, I need to either set an inf wedge, or, some people do inf phalanx, I don't do it, but some people do. There's not necessarily a wrong answer. I feel like it just depends on, ultimately what you have access to. It's like, ultimately the counter is all that's really important here, okay? But, you would think, well, sitting in cav wedge or cav phalanx makes sense when infantry's coming at you, and it does. But kind of like this guy here that's, setting a rally on this guy over here. Okay? The mindset and the reasoning behind, like, every rally lead right from the get-go, and we can see this live, is that they're not going to show you their main gear. Their artifact collection stars and castle stars are all there. But one thing that, when I stress this, if you're not up to par, meaning that your stats are not up to par, okay, one thing that a lot of people gripe about is, well, what is, if my gear is any good, is it going to work? Is my comp going to work? And so one thing that you need to be really conscious of is, while you can trap with 300%, meaning you don't necessarily need to have, you don't need to have like 4, 5, or 600%. But the closer and higher that number is, the less damage you're going to inflict upon yourself. And ultimately, the more efficient of a trap you're going to be. And obviously a lot of people will pitch the fact that getting the counter research for about 30 million might is about how much that counter research from military comes through, at least from what I've gotten out of it. You're basically gonna give yourself 30 to ish percent, which is fine. And then you can tack on another 10% from Jade Worm. And also you can get another, I think like 6, 7, 10, 15, I think it's like 15% off of the hero that comes up. But the main thing is that you're basically aiming to get the most amount of damage to a counter as possible. So even, little things like heroes, yeah, they do matter. Ultimately, I kind of learned this later on, but it's like your wall setup is going to have a really big play in how well you're going to do as a rally trap or a solo trap, really. Like, this current comp that I have, I don't like Bomb and Goblin, but I have Bomb and Goblin. And the only reason I like Bomb and Goblin is because I'm getting that 20% army attack. Now, I could sit down and use this instead. And there's not a whole lot wrong with that, except that's one range hero to a 2 inf 2 cav setup, which doesn't really work for me, because more often than not, I'm not getting hit in range. I'm more often getting hit by players that are sending cavalry, or they're sending infantry. Very rarely does anybody send range. So, if I happen to know that somebody's sending range, yeah, I'll probably swap over to this in a hurry. But most of the time, if I was really wanting to nitpick it, what I'd actually do is, I'll either try to get an army HP and army attack bonus here, or I could even go one step further and get somebody like, well, for example, like you can get any, hero that's going to give you a 50% HP bonus and a 30% attack bonus. The best ones are obviously the ones that give you both the defense, the HP, and the attack all at the same time, because those are all one types, right? But the challenge is how do you unbound and how do you pick your heroes? What familiars do you use? That, generally speaking, this right now, this is what I'm using. This works fine. There's nothing really technically wrong with it. The only thing I want to swap out is Bomb and Goblin for either an army hero. Like, personally, I love Lore Weaver just because of the utility of having Lore Weaver in Colosseum. But you're not going to go you're not going to go wrong with someone like Stormfox, even, because the training bonus from Stormfox is worth its weight in gold too. Really about the only downside is I'm losing army defense for that. But, hey, training speed, it's worth it. Now, given that I've, kind of given you an itinerary of that, the other thing I think is really worthwhile is getting the Shaman Blessing, the Spirit Sacrifice bonus. And while I don't have it here yet, you also more than likely need to get Nosseros, because I think Nosseros is a really, really helpful piece in that bonus tree. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to have all three of these, because really a lot of people will tell you that you need to have Weevil and Aquirus, because Aquirus and Weevil are basically going to proc right at the beginning of the battle, and therefore you're going to get a 15% gain off of your opponent, regardless of what they're sending, which, that seems practical, especially if you're getting rallied. You don't know what's coming at you, but more often than not, I feel like, if I'm going to nitpick it and I know I've got a single rally, it makes more sense to me rather than dropping an army by 15. I can actually nitpick that and say, okay, well, if I know it's range coming, I will swap to Magma Lord to drop their HP by 40. That's a lot more than 15. The same is also true if I, know it's infantry, I can go with Terror Spike, or, alternatively, you can go with Jazik if you happen to know it's cavalry. But chances are you're never going to use Magma Lord. More often, you're going to use Terror Spike and Jazik. So if you're going to nitpick it, I'd say Jazik and Terror Spike are going to be some of the first two you're going to grab. Now, Jade Worm is a big question mark. A lot of people wonder whether or not to get this guy, whether or not you should. Obviously, this guy is a big advantage if you're in counter, because any of these counter bonuses that you're getting there, that adds up. Like, you're going to get a pretty significant advantage by having it versus not having it. So there's no reason not to get it, especially when you counter somebody, which is practically what every trap ought to be doing. Unless you get in those instances where you are fighting troop type on troop type, which I try to avoid. It's like when that happens, it's just a bloody nightmare. But ultimately, what you want to try and aim for here is Divine Fire. Now, Divine Fire, I think, would be kind of a nice choice for a 9% gain that you could either put into a fourth slot. In other words, rather than just having 3, you could put them in that fourth slot. And then I think that really, really works well. Or, alternatively, you could just as easily swap them out for that 40% drop. And that's going to give you a 9% defense buffer rather than taking 40 off of their army. But whether or not, you should get that fourth slot, that's a good question. It's like research might is a big, big deal here. The more research might you have, the less troop might you have to work with, unless you're not concerned about might. Right now I'm at 520 million might, and even that to me, compared to where I was about 400 and some odd million might, and I was doing just fine. The main thing here is composition, right? A lot of people have been wondering about composition here, and I'm going to go ahead and just kind of give you a spiel of what composition I'm using. Now, I don't think you need anywhere past 2 mil. 2 mil is pretty much the breaking point. And then the amount of T4 you have, I think it's about 4.5 million to 5 million. 6 million's ideal. Higher amounts of T2 is great if you're like wanting to take multiple rallies at a time. That really works well into your advantage. It's like you can't go wrong there. Okay, so like here I've got this guy. He's coming after me already. I'm just sitting here relaxed as a cucumber, and this guy's gonna go ahead and try and rally me.
No! No!